This video is going to be in two halves. I'm going to talk about my feelings on the S5iiX independently, and then I'm going to take you on a real world shoot with the GH6 and the new camera and compare the two. And from here on out, I'm going to call it the X because it's a bit of a blooming mouthful. Okay, let's get into it. If I was starting a YouTube channel in 2023, the X is the camera that I would buy without a shadow of a doubt. It has all the features you need, it has rock solid AF, and it's just a great value position for the price point that it's at. Similarly, if I was starting my wedding business again, now instead of 10 years ago, I would go with the X and the S5 Mark II and maybe some cheaper S5 models for some multicam shots. I just think for the price, you can't get anything better. The colors are phenomenal and all of the features are just exactly what you need for these sorts of scenarios. You must know this by now, but the AF is absolutely incredible on both the X and the S5 Mark II. Now that I've had a couple of months of real world use, it just consistently blows me away. One moment in particular in recent months is when I was shooting in Amsterdam on a boat, presenting objects to the camera. And the background was moving, I was moving, and there was not one single moment of that whole day that was out of focus. Even when I was going through tunnels, it just locked onto my face, and it was absolutely brilliant. I'm in a bush. You see, even just moving the camera a little bit, there's no faffing. I'd have to sort of reframe everything on the GH6. Anyway, so let's get over some superficial stuff because you know on this channel I love an interesting looking camera, I like nice coloured cameras, and I absolutely love what they've done with the X. The black on black is such a beautiful upgrade from the S5 Mark II in my opinion. I think it looks sleek and brilliant. Though I will say when I was shooting at the launch event in a very dark room, trying to find the right modes on the dials was quite entertaining, so I may buy some glow-in-the-dark paint. So let's talk a little bit about a comparison with the GH6 and this recent shoot that I did just yesterday, in fact. It's been a very busy weekend. So in the past, I have said that I didn't mind the APSC Crop too much. I don't mind the APSC Crop. I mean, do I wish it was there? No, but it's perfectly manageable. On the X and the S5 Mark II, anything past 30p does have an APS-C crop. And now after a few months of real world use, a lot of real world use, I sort of retract that statement a little bit. It's not the worst thing in the world, but sometimes it has interrupted my personal workflow, particularly coming from the GH6 when that isn't an issue at all. For instance, at this aerial shoot, I wanted a mixture of 6K open gate on the X to do some vertical reels, and I wanted to do some 48p and 60p slow motion. I also needed to shoot in primes because it's the look I needed and certain elements of it were quite dark. So I couldn't use a stock lens to sort of compensate for the APS-C crop on the fly. I found myself having to reposition myself every time I changed from 24p to 48p, for example. It was a little bit of a logistical nightmare because I was working around the photographer, who's Rebecca, who shoots the Lumix G9, and she's absolutely amazing, by the way. And I found that more often than not, even though I was technically out to shoot the X, I was picking up my GH6 because I didn't have the SSD to contend with and there was no crop to contend with. So I could just get into position and change between the 24p, 48p, 60p and 120p in 4K on the GH6. Let's not forget that. We only have 120p in HD on the X and it is also with an APS-C crop. Now, I will say it is about as beautiful as HD footage can get. The bitrate is really high and it's very beautiful, but because I'm shooting for a show reel and for socials, I don't have the opportunity to punch in and change to vertical as much as I do with the GH6 footage in this particular example. So let's talk about the SSD conundrum. I might be slightly different to a few people in the sense that I don't necessarily want a massive rig when I go out to work. I want to have as much done internally without faff as humanly possible. Though I will say that the SSD recording is a great innovation and it will be perfect for certain users. I'm just not sure I'm one of them. Let me explain. Here is our imaginary workflow. We go out to one particular job and we want the best quality possible. So we record to the SSD on the X. Brilliant. There's no recording limits, you know, your footage is in safe hands because the SSD is inherently a little bit more reliable. And then we get home, we pop it in the computer and we can edit straight off that drive. We finish that project, format the drive or, you know, dump off the footage, and then we're ready to rock for day 2 on job number 2. Now, if you do work in a very linear fashion, it's ideal. It's great. It's very streamlined and quick, and you don't have to dump your footage and wait 40 minutes for like thousands of gigabytes to copy over. However, if you're a little bit more scattershot like me, I might have 4 projects on the go that are half finished. It might be a couple of YouTube projects, it might be a wedding film, and I need to dump off the footage anyway because I can't just leave one project on the SSD. It'll effectively make that SSD unusable until I finish that one specific project. So for my personal workflow, which is a little bit all over the place because I'm very busy and do a lot of weird things, I much prefer having things on cards, copying it over to my SSD that I edit from on my computer, and not having to worry with the SSD on the camera. But your mileage may completely vary, and you might look at the SSD recording and go, that is the coolest thing ever. And I would absolutely understand where you're coming from. Now with the X, we can now do 48p and 60p up to 800 megabits per second, all intra 422 10-bit. That's lots of words. If you're a video techie person, you'll know how amazing that is. Here's a thing that sort of put me on the fence a little bit, is you can do that internally onto the CF Express card on the GH6 already. So for me, coming from the GH6, where it's all internal and quite minimal, over to the X, it did seem like there was one extra level of faff that I had to deal with. But we have to consider that this is a full frame camera doing this versus a Micro Four Thirds sensor. And you do have an APS-C Crop in both of those modes, but it's still a larger sensor compared to the GH6, even if there's no crop on the GH6. I hope that makes sense. So let's run through the workflow. We need to secure the SSD on our X, which means we probably need a cage. So you put the cage on and you put your SSD on, and then we need to secure the cable, because you would be a crazy person if in a professional environment you didn't secure the cable. If that comes out mid-take, you are screwed. So you secure the cable, and then the flippy screen comes out. Bang, we can no longer articulate the flippy screen. So we need a monitor. So you put the monitor on. That's fine. People love monitors. I just think it's one more thing to charge, one more thing to think about. Cable city. I love on the GH6 that you can record to SSD and use the articulating screen and not have to use a monitor. I find the focus peaking features, etc., in both cameras, to be honest, absolutely fine, and I'd rather not use a monitor unless I absolutely have to. So setting up the SSD on the X does sort of cause a cascade of fun problems. We need the cage to secure the SSD, we need to secure the cable, we need a monitor because we can't use the screen. If you like having a cage and a rig and a bigger camera for certain professional jobs, it's not a problem at all. If you're like me and like to keep things a little bit minimal, it does mean you are probably restricted. I mean, it's a very bad way to use the word restricted, because the things that you can use without the SSD are phenomenal. You are restricted to what you can film without the SSD attached. I think the X is the perfect hybrid camera. If you need to have a job where you're shooting photo and video, if the lighting is a bit tricky, you have the full frame joy and the low light wonderful performance. Now don't get me wrong, the GH6 can take superb photos, but the low light comparison is night and day, pardon the pun. You do get so much more out of the full frame sensor and the dual native ISO of the X, and also the S5 Mark II, and also the S5. So if low light is a massive consideration for you, if you're not bringing your own lights, if you are in tricky situations all the time, then the X would be absolutely a brilliant choice. If you're in more controlled environments, if you only do sort of low light every so often, then the GH6 is also absolutely fine. So going forward, what am I going to choose? What am I going to pick up when I'm heading out the door for my client work? Will it be the X or will it be the GH6? My needs are very different to other people's. I think I have very niche and bizarre jobs. And for me, I do find the APS-C Crop a little bit limiting now that I've had a good few months to live with it. So if I'm doing something that I'm not changing between 24p and slow motion throughout the day, I will reach for the X. This would be great for weddings because most of the day I am shooting in at least 48p with the APS-C Crop. If, like this aerial shoot, I'm out and I'm constantly changing between different formats that will require a crop or not, I find it one more thing that I have to think about and consider for my composition, and it really does annoy me. But I will say, for this price point, every camera has an APS-C Crop. Not like a full frame camera exists at this price point that doesn't have this issue. So at this price point, we're stuck with the APS-C Crop. It's not a criticism overly, it's how it's affecting my workflow, if that makes sense. So for certain jobs where I am swapping and changing all the time, it's just so much easier to pick up the GH6. And the slow motion features, I keep banging on about the slow motion features in the GH6, is industry leading at this price point. You cannot find better. And the 4K 120p, if you are someone that requires slow motion semi-regularly, very easily with audio and AF, it's just a no-brainer. The GH6 is phenomenal for those kinds of formats and styles. The HD in the X, as I've said, is pretty good, but it's still HD. Yeah, I'd rather have the GH6 and the 4K 120 any day of the week if I'm shooting slow motion. For content creation like this, I'm picking up the X every day of the week. And as I said at the beginning, if I was starting a YouTube channel today, the X would be the one. It does everything that you need. For my video-centric professional workflow, I think most of the time I am going to stick with the GH6. I like the ergonomics, I like the way that the screen works, I like that I can get the higher formats internally without the need of an SSD, I like the 4K 120p. And I appreciate that I'm super privileged to have access to both. Honestly, if you're coming into this now, either will do wonders for you. They're both incredible tools, and I'm just a spoilt brat at this point, but that is my honest thoughts on the subject. The APSC Crop and the slow motion features, I've been too spoiled with the GH6 to go back. So check out the GH6 and S5 Mark II comparison next, and let me know your thoughts and feelings in the comments. What do you think of the X? It's a bit sexy, isn't it?